Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the first of a double bill today. Later on, Paul Johnson is joining us to talk about various allied peoples who aided the enemy, spies, broadcasters, traitors, all sorts of things. But that's later on at 7 p.m. UK time. Right now, well, we have discussed POWs in the ETO and especially downed pilots and air crews quite a lot on the channel. But today we are looking at what happened to some of India's captured soldiers, many of whom endured brutal treatment in labor camps. Others got involved in escapes. They were fighting for various different reasons and causes. My guest is his new book is available to pre-order. Links in the description below via pen and sword. I'll bring him in now. Good day. How are you today?
I'm very well, Paul. Thanks for having me.
So I love it when we get people who have got a real interest, a particular aspect from it. And, you know, Singapore, UK is your sort of background there. But what drew you to start writing about this subject? Because it's quite complicated because there are Indians on both sides of the campaign. Politics changed over the decades. And we were just talking before going live that, you know, finding these stories written down, finding diaries must be harder in some ways. But what drew you to the story? What was your interest in getting this book out there?
Well, it was a series of very fortuitous events. Basically, I've lived half my life in India and the second half in Singapore, where I am now. And I collect, historical items about India and Singapore. And unlike most people who wake up in the morning and check their bank balance or the share prices, what I check is auction alerts. And about 3 years ago, I woke up and I saw this auction alert for Singapore. And it had a description of a very interesting set of newspapers that were published during the war in the Changi prison camp in 1942. And it sounded, incredible. And I said, every museum in the world would be going after this, so there's no point bidding. And so I first decided not to bid. There's something in my mind that made me say, okay, in the vague chance that something might happen, I put in the minimum bid and I went to sleep. And the next morning I woke up and I found that I had won the lot. And not only had I won the lot, but no one else had bid. So I got it at an even lower price. Of course, my first reaction was it must be useless because no one else bid. But I discovered that it was probably the best £1,000 I've ever spent in my life. It turned out to be a set of it was not the actual newspapers published in 1942, but it was a set of documents created by the editors of these newspapers. These were civilian internees interned by the Japanese after the surrender of Singapore. And they typed up all the content because they thought that newspapers wouldn't survive posterity. And thank God they did, because there's only one set of the newspapers that exist. So they typed this up and they made, I believe, 2 copies. One is in the Imperial War Museum and the other one is lying in my cupboard right here, 5 feet from me. The first thing that intrigued me was that it talked about internees, and I knew what a summer intern was, but I didn't know what an internee was. And I thought I'd read a lot about World War II, but I realized that I had read about the prisoners of war who were the army prisoners of war, but these guys were the civilians. Yeah. These were the civil servants, etc., etc. And I found that of the city that had been my home for more than 20 years, this was one aspect of the war that I knew nothing about. And then I started reading up on other aspects of Singapore's war that I didn't know much about. And one of them was the Indian Army. And since I was from India, I found it very interesting. I was told that the Indian troops were sent by Japan to various islands in the Pacific to do hard labor, which I didn't know about. So I started researching the Papua New Guinea saga, which we'll get to later in the talk. And I found out a lot of information about it. Fortunately, there was a vast amount of information online. And I have to confess, there's a lot of the research I've done sitting in my pajamas in the sitting room.
Well, we all do that. Yeah.
Okay. So then I started, moving backwards. Okay, they went to PNG. I found out what happened to them there. And then moving backwards, I found they came from Singapore. And putting all the pieces together, there was from various sources available quite easily a whole narrative of what happened to these Indian soldiers during the Second World War. So that's how the story began. And I found the story very moving, very interesting. And fortunately, the publishers agreed. And so here I am.
And here you are indeed. And so one of the things I often say on this channel is that as a Brit growing up in Essex, when we talk about Malaya or the fighting in India or Burma, it's called the Far East. It always seems to be a distant war.
Yes.
But if you're from India or
Yes.
Singapore, it's not
Yeah.
a distant war. It's on your doorstep. So what? It's a long way away from Britain, but it's a local war, and so I think that's that perspective of being a prisoner or interned in the region you're from, I think is very interesting. So anyway, we'll bring up the slide. So folks, if you have questions, fire away, but I think they will be answered as we go along. But I'm going to hand over to my guest to take us through this story. So over to you, sir.
Thanks, Paul. So basically, the book is called The Forgotten Indian Prisoners of World War II. The subtitle, Surrender, Loyalty, Betrayal, and Hell, was actually a very interesting subtitle suggested to me by one of the various friends who have helped me research and write this book, without whom this book really would not have been possible. I was extremely surprised and very happy at the extent at which people unfailingly sort of helped me out. I was a total nobody, and I'm a bit less than a total nobody now, maybe, but I'm still a nobody, but still they helped me. And I must mention two people specifically, Dr. Guy Bowman and Dr. Sundar Chandaram, both of who expired earlier this year.
Yeah, no, sad loss. Guy's lost. Yeah, absolutely.
Guy was fantastic. I reached out to him, and he even arranged a 2-hour Zoom call to take me through what he had done and what sort of documents and archives I should look for. Anyway, so this is what the book is about. It's about the Indian Army in Singapore. And when we look at the war in the Far East, one thing that I didn't know about was that it actually began in the first conflict, the first interaction between Japan and the Allied forces was not in Pearl Harbor, but 50 minutes earlier in northern Malaya on the eastern coast at the place called Kota Baru, where there were 4 Indian infantry battalions, and they were the ones facing the first Japanese landing. And of course, as many of us know, the campaign, which we're not getting into in detail today, was, to say the least, a disaster. And within 70 days, Malaya and then Singapore surrendered. So Singapore was surrendered on 15th February 1942, just 70 days after the campaign. And on that day, it happened in the evening, so nothing much happened that day in terms of how the prisoners were organized. But on the next day, the Japanese got to work. So they organized they had a plan of what to do for all the civilians and what to do for all the POWs. And they organized, they made sure that the Indians were segregated from the British and the Australians. And they did one thing. Paul, could you just go back to the previous slide for a bit?
We can indeed.
Yeah. So on the 16th, the next day, they decided to segregate the British and the Australians. And at that time, most of the officers in the Indian Army were British. So all the commanders of the battalions, all the second in commands, all the company commanders, and everyone senior in the hierarchy were all British. There were a few Indian officers, but most of them were British. And to have the commanding officer and your company commander being removed from looking after you was a huge shock to the Indians when they were told that this was to happen on 16 February. And I'll just read out a short extract. This was written by Lieutenant Colonel George Clough, who commanded the 4th 19th Hyderabad Regiment. And he writes of the segregation that was ordered on the 16th of February, and in his case, happened on the early morning of February 17th. He said on 17th Feb at 0700 hours, the Indian ranks, including all officers of Indian nationality, fell in. There were a few Indian officers in this battalion. The British officers said goodbye. It was a very sad moment. Many were unable to speak. Some had tears in their eyes. Others were crying. Leaving their arms behind, they marched off to their prison camp. He's referring to the Indians marching off. Approximately 350 went. Many had fought extremely well. Others could not stand the pace. Still, they had tried. So this is a description of the pathos, the poignancy of the separation of the British officers from the Indian soldiers. And the Indian soldiers were asked to collect the next on the 17th of February at a place called Farrer Park, which was at that time the polo grounds of Singapore, and it's adjacent. It was a huge ground adjacent to what is now Little India. And in that ground, the Indian soldiers gathered, and later on that afternoon, they witnessed a spectacle that we'll go into a bit more detail later. But I must start by mentioning the historical hero of my book, Captain Mohan Singh of the 14th Punjab Regiment. He was on stage, and he gave a very fiery speech. You can see this image of him
Yep.
speaking from the pavilion on the grounds, and the reaction he got from the soldiers was uh, very surprising to many. And we'll go into the reactions and why that happened in a bit. So, moving on to the next slide, this Mohan Singh was announced as a leader of something called the Indian National Army, which most of the Indians had not heard about. And the Indian National Army was announced on that day. The Indian soldiers were told that your choice was either remain as a POW under Japan, or you join the Indian National Army that will be supported by Japan to invade India and throw the British out. And that was what the purported goal of the INA was. However, this INA did not start. It did not. The cheering of the soldiers was not spontaneous. It didn't happen just on the cuff. There was a long build-up to this, and this is the slide where I'll go through the build-up. The build-up was that the Japanese, before they invaded on 8th December 1941, had spent the previous 18 to 24 months in setting up or trying to set up a sort of a CIA type operation, old CIA style, where they approached all the locals of the countries in Southeast Asia, the Indonesians, the Malays, the Vietnamese, the Burmese, and told them, look, why are you living under the colonial rule of the British or the Dutch or the French, depending on which country they were talking about? Join us in freeing Asia for in ridding you of colonial rule and claiming Asia for the Asiatics. The Japanese actually got no love on this from most people, except perhaps from Burma, where Aung San Suu Kyi's father decided to ally with the Japanese. Of course, that's another story that we won't get into today. In the course of this research, the Japanese found one other thing. They found that in every country in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, Burma, French Indochina, which is now Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, there was one group of people that was there in every country, and these were Indians. There were 2 million Indians in Southeast Asia. Many of them were plantation laborers in Malaya, but the others were very well educated, very well off. They were lawyers, they were businessmen, they were policemen, they were the famous tall Sikh doorkeepers at the various hotels, such as the Raffles Hotel. And they were also very well organized. Each country had a sort of an Indian association that tried to, get the interests of Indians in that country met either through commercial contracts or other things. And in Tokyo, the Japanese had contacts with Indian nationalists who had fled from Britain to various parts of Asia, including Tokyo. And from that contact, they set about meeting up with the Indian nationalists. And this meeting occurred in Bangkok, which is the capital of Thailand, as we all know. And it happened in Bangkok because if we try to look back at Asia in 1941, Southeast Asia in 1941, Thailand was the only independent country. Every other country was a colony, and even China, large parts of it were under Japanese control. So all the spying in Asia happened in Bangkok. That was a spying center. And so Major Fujiwara Iwaichi of the Japanese Army Intelligence was sent to Bangkok in October 1941. He'd already done a reconnaissance of Southeast Asia, and he felt that the Indians, there were Indians all over. There were Indian soldiers in Malaya, Singapore, and Burma, and in Hong Kong. And there were Indian nationalists who were working to try to, get India independent. So in Bangkok, Fujiwara met up with this Indian nationalist called Gyani Pritam Singh. He's the other person on the slide. Fujiwara says in his memoirs that he expected a tall, burly Sikh, but instead he met a very slight man. But as you can see, he describes it himself that he had a very fiery, passion burning in his eyes, which I think comes out in this photograph.
You can see it in the photo, yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
You can see it in the photograph. So the two of them got together, and they said, "We have a common enemy, Britain. Why don't we work together? We, Japan, will, you Indians in Southeast Asia, help us capture Malaya and Singapore, and we, the Japanese, will help you, will arm you to invade India and throw the British out. So this is, this was the agreement that they had, and they got together. And in 1941, Gyani Pritam Singh started sending leaflets into the British Army camps all over Malaya. And these leaflets were written in the local Indian languages. And they said things like, "Don't fight for these English dogs." I'm using that word specifically because that is actually what he
Hmm.
wrote in Hindi and Urdu and Gurmukhi, the Punjabi language, that sort of stuff, very, fiery anti-British, propaganda. So they were all ready when the war began on 8th December. There were small teams there were about 30 people from Fujiwara's side and Pritam Singh's side who accompanied the Japanese troops who were invading Thailand and Malaya. And they started spreading this propaganda across Malaya right from the beginning. And when I started discovering this, I asked myself this question: that did this indeed impact the campaign? And it might seem that it did, but from what I have discovered, there were in all about 8,000 Indian prisoners, Indians who became prisoners in the campaign in Malaya, out of about 50,000 in all who were there. And 200 of them joined the Japanese to actually actively be involved in the invasion of Malaya. So I really don't think that that would have really made any difference, but it's an interesting thing, that question that occurred to me. So anyway, so we've done all this. We've, Singapore was invaded on 8th February, and on 15th February, Singapore surrendered. And on 17th February, where we were talking about Mohan Singh and Farah Park, you can see this picture of the thousands of Indian soldiers. There were 40,000 of them crammed into this field. The event was very, very well organized. What the they had food, water, and medical aid arranged because they knew it was going to be an all-day long event. When all the soldiers gathered, it was all a confused mass and a confused melee. And in the beginning, they were asked to segregate themselves not into their units, but into their castes and creeds. So this was done very purposely because they wanted to split up the fact that you were in the Hyderabad regiment or the Punjab regiment, and they wanted to put all the Sikhs together, all the Gurkhas together, all the Punjabi Muslims together, and so on. And some of those 200 men who had accompanied Japan on the invasion of Singapore spread out in this crowd and tried to talk to them about this new Indian National Army and how the Japanese were very good and would help them conquer India. And then, in a very, very deliberate stage managing of the whole event, a British officer of the Indian Army, Lieutenant Colonel Hunt, was asked to begin the whole ceremony. He went on stage and spoke in Hindi to the whole crowd, Hindustani as it was called then, and told them that we have surrendered, and from now on, just like you used to obey our orders, now you must obey the orders of the Japanese. And this was done purposely to humiliate Britain and to show the assembled soldiers, to re-stress. They already knew, of course, that Britain had surrendered, to re-stress that Britain had been humiliated by Japan, and so on. After this, Hunt passes on the microphone to Major Fujiwara, the Japanese intelligence officer, who speaks in Japanese. And this man is very interesting because not only does he not speak Hindustani, he doesn't even speak English. So his speech in Japanese is translated sentence by sentence, first by a Japanese from Japanese to English, and then by an Indian officer from English into Hindustani. And this this Indian officer was very carefully chosen as well. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Gill. He was chosen specifically because he was the senior most Indian combatant officer in Singapore at that time. And for him to be on stage uh, participating in this event was it was a very, very big move to show to the soldiers that even your senior most officer is on our side. After Fujiwara, who has been handed the baton by Hunt, now in turn hands the baton on to Captain Mohan Singh, who he introduces and says, he is now your commander in chief. And then Mohan Singh comes, and Mohan Singh is he's a 5'7", of very slight build. He is unknown outside his battalion. He was till yesterday a commander of a company of 100 men. And now he has been asked to lead an army almost of 60,000 POWs.
Wow.
Now, 60,000 men is probably commanded by, a 3-star general and even maybe a 4-star general in some cases. And the thing that fascinated me about him was how he was able to assert his control over these 60,000 men, and more importantly, the dozens of officers who were senior to him. So there were many captains senior to him, many majors and lieutenant colonels, of course, who were also senior to him. And he did it through a combination of course, authority from the Japanese, as well as being very wily in terms of how he organized the whole setup. And though after the war, many Indian officers who joined him later on said that they didn't trust him, they didn't believe in him, but at least while he was the boss, he was totally in charge, and no one dared challenge him. Moving on to the next slide, we must look at what were the Indian soldiers thinking when Mohan Singh asked them, "Will you join the Indian National Army to throw Britain out of India?" The reaction was, and this is from several reports, the entire crowd went wild, is the term that was used. They threw their caps in the air, and so on and so forth. This was a very, very startling reaction, because the Indian army had sworn loyalty to the King of England, and for them to not only, throw that oath away, but also to do so by joining the Japanese army seemed like doubly strange. And I think the motivation of these men has been misunderstood by some people, especially me. And there were two schools of thought. One school of thought, which is my school of thought, was that before I studied this, was that they were all traitors, and that it was very foolhardy to try to get Japanese help to free India. What were they expecting? That the Japanese would just leave India? That was one school of thought. The other school of thought, which is, many people do believe this, that these soldiers were very brave, very nationalistic, and they did this to, for the freedom of India. And of course, there were, some people who did that, but I believe that neither of these two is the truth. And the truth is a very complex mix of motives and reasons for these Indian soldiers. So if we think of what happened to them, they had witnessed the collapse of the British Empire before their eyes.
Yeah.
To them, the British Empire was over. Not only had it collapsed in front of their eyes, it had collapsed in 70 days. Not only that, it had been defeated by what was considered an inferior Asian power at that time, the Japanese, right? And so they had witnessed this. For them, the British Empire was over. And then the next day, the British officers were segregated, and they were now suddenly faced with this dilemma: what do I do? Do I face the treatment of the Japanese and being a POW under them? They had witnessed in the campaign the brutal treatment that the Japanese had meted out to prisoners. Many Indians and British and Australian prisoners were shot. Some were bayoneted. Some were executed with swords. And they'd also seen what they'd done to the civilians in Malaya. And they were soon to see what was going to be done to especially the Chinese civilians in Singapore. So this was the dilemma in front of them. And two officers who studied this in great detail, Indian officers, have described this as, one of them described the INA as a great attraction to the Indian soldiers, because they had suddenly, for India, Britain had ruled India for almost 2 centuries, and most Indians did not really know the concept of a country. India was segregated into several hundred kingdoms, and most people thought of their village as their country, or at the battalion as their country. But in the last few decades, an element of nationalist feeling had come about, and suddenly now they were feeling themselves, that they were thinking of themselves as Indians, and so for them it was a great attraction.
I think as well, it's the we now have the benefit of knowing what the end of the story was. We know what happened over the ensuing years, and we can see fully the goodies and the baddies, for want of a better expression. But the same thing is happening in places like Lithuania and Latvia. It's happening in Romania. It's happening in Yugoslavia. People are being faced with real dilemmas
Choices.
of
Yes.
of different levels of awfulness. You know, a power that has been overseeing you has been either removed or defeated, and there's a new power coming in that you're not quite sure what it's offering. But you've got to make, you can't just keep your head in the sand. You've got to make some sort of decision, even if you
Yes.
don't have all the information to make that decision. I think that
Yeah.
that late 41, early 42 period is very interesting around the world of what dilemmas these nations are facing, and not just nations, individuals within these nations.
Yeah. No, that's very right. It's very good that you use the word dilemma, which is exactly what I have here.
Yeah.
So, even after when I started researching this, I, of course, read several histories written by both British and Indian authors, American authors as well. And many of them pointed out that the fact that, it was a dilemma. They had to choose between being very possibly badly treated by the Japanese, or you know trying to fight for India's freedom. I still didn't believe it
Mm.
uh, till I continued reading the archives, and I found that after the war, British intelligence, who interviewed thousands of these soldiers, there was a unit called SISDIC, which uh, it was called the Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Center. Their job was to interview anyone who came from Japanese occupied territory, be they civilian or military, back before they entered India, to make sure that their loyalties were. Were they just refugees returning, or were they Japanese spies? And they interviewed thousands of INA men during the war and also after the war. And their analysis was that uh, the question should not be asked as to why these men joined the INA. The question should be asked, why did those who did not join, why did they not join? Which was very
Right. Yeah.
striking for me to see this in black and white, written by a Briton, because I really didn't expect this. And they also said that this was the expected thing to have done. They also gave details of how many of those British officers that I mentioned, who were in the Indian army, had been segregated. They had smuggled out notes to their Indian soldiers telling them, don't hesitate, just join the INA, this is the right thing to do. And this really surprised me. I have to confess, because I didn't expect this. And the last piece of the puzzle was when I looked at this incredible archive that, it's like an Aladdin's cave of wartime information. It consists of these thousands of interrogations,
Mm.
which were, made by SISDIC, performed by SISDIC in typical British style. Everything was documented. Even if they sneezed, they would write down that this is what I did. And so it's an incredible archive. All these papers were left behind in India at independence in 1947, and they were declassified 50 years later and are now digitized and online, available on the National Archives of India. And these interrogations are really, they tell you a detail of the soldier. And again, one might think these interrogations, these interrogations were when the soldier was being interrogated by the winning power, Britain.
Yeah.
One would expect that he would say whatever he thought would please the British. And indeed, some of them did do that. But there's a very large number of these soldiers who remained defiant, even when they were being interrogated by the British during or after the war. If they showed that they were pro INA, they were liable to be hanged in case they were accused of treason, which, in fact, by joining the INA, they had committed treason. But, they were still quite defiant. And so, though there may be some men who said what the British wanted to hear, but there was a very large number who didn't. So it's a very interesting archive, which I urge anyone who's interested in this part of history to look at. So
Brilliant.
anyway, after looking at all this, we find that the Indian soldiers, many of them joined the INA. The INA was formally promulgated in September 1942. Here's a picture of a parade held on the 10th of September. You can see on the left the INA flag, which is actually the same as the flag of the Indian National Congress, which is a very prominent political party that was, very prominent then and remains prominent today. On the right-hand side, you see, of course, the Japanese flag,
Yeah.
because the Japanese influence was, of course, very strong there. And of the number of soldiers in the Indian National Army, there were, when surrender occurred, 62,000 Indian POWs. By the end of the year, there were about 45,000 in Singapore, of whom 40,000 volunteered. Now, About half of these volunteered very early on, very willingly, and the other half took a bit of time, and there was some encouragement given by Mohan Singh. So what happened to the other half was that they didn't know what to do, and there were a bunch of senior of officers and NCOs who were spreading anti-INA propaganda amongst these soldiers. So what Mohan Singh did was he called these guys who were spreading the anti-INA propaganda. He said, "Look, everyone has to choose on their own. If you don't want to join, no problem, but you do not spread anti-INA propaganda amongst the rest." Many of them refused to heed him, and it is these men who, dozens of them actually, who were uh, brought together in what was called a concentration camp and were treated very harshly, is the term I've used in my book. But essentially, they were beaten up every day till they agreed to stop proselytizing, and then eventually, the remaining 40% also. So they said, "Okay, fine, we succumb," and then the remaining 40% of the men joined, and eventually, only about 5,000 of the 45,000 men in Singapore did not volunteer for the INA. However, the Japanese were really not interested in 40,000 well-armed Indian men in Singapore. They had a very small garrison there, and they refused to arm all these 40,000 men. They said, "We don't need 40,000 men." And they earlier said, "We just need 2,000-3,000 men." Mohan Singh argued with them, and they said, "Okay, let's form a division of 17,000." So the initial INA, or the first INA as it's called under Mohan Singh, had 17,000 men. And it is those men who were parading in the previous picture. But soon the bonhomie between Mohan Singh and the Japanese collapsed. Mohan Singh realized that the Japanese were really not serious about what they were saying about helping arming the entire Indian army who was willing to join them to invade India. He also had a very unrealistic expectation that only Indians would be used to invade India and no Japanese soldiers would come.
Right.
They would be supplied with Japanese cannons and tanks and Japanese Air Force and so on. This is very unrealistic, but this is what he wanted, and the Japanese refused. They also refused to sign formally that they were going to leave India free, and they said, "We've already given you enough promises, and we don't need to do any more." So then
Just a quick question for you.
Yes.
The early volunteers, the ones who sort of signed up right at the beginning, and you said it was a
Yes.
gradual process and there was
Yes.
coercion and bullying involved. Is there a particular region that seemed to provide more volunteers, or caste, or background, or age, or is it just sort of a random across the board?
Interesting question. Very good question. The initial group was very heavily Sikh and Punjabi Muslim focused, because Mohan Singh was not only Sikh, but he was also in the Punjab Regiment.
Right.
Now, the Punjab Regiment, which was the bulk of the battalions, there were several Punjab Regiment battalions in amongst the POWs. They were all on most of them on Mohan Singh's side. So not just the Sikhs, but also the Punjabi Muslims in the Punjab regiments. And there were also there were one or two other important sects of India. So one of the senior most Indian NCOs in Mohan Singh's battalion was the Subedar Major, who was the senior most Indian below officer rank. He was what was called a Dogra, and he was on Mohan Singh's side. Dogras are from northern India, and he was instrumental in getting many of the Dogras to join the first INA. So it's a good question. And the most of the initial joiners were Sikhs, Punjabi Muslims, and Dogras. There was, however, some element of communal some element of communal tension, because there were many Muslims who considered the INA, which was aligned with the Congress party, as a Hindu party. Very strange to see that when we look at what's happening in India today. And so they were worried, but those were more on the officer side. On the Punjab regiments, most of the Punjab regiment Punjabi Muslims all joined Mohan Singh. So yes. So when
some of the stories, let's by the way, people are loving this. It's a fantastic presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so moving on away from the INA, there were many other things that happened to these soldiers besides the INA. One of them was a series of escapes that were conducted by Indians from Singapore to try to reach India. Now, the reason why it was easier for Indians to escape than Britons or Australians was quite obvious. They could mix and blend into the crowd because there were many Indians in Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
So some of them immediately escaped from Farrer Park and started, living in Singapore itself as they started, taking up jobs and working locally. But there's one interesting escape which began on the 7th of May 1942. There were three officers led by Lieutenant Pillai, whose sketch is on the right hand side. Lieutenant Pillai, Radhakrishnan, and Natarajan. All three were from the south of India, from what is now Tamil Nadu. And they got together and decided to escape. It was the brainchild of Lieutenant Pillai. He tied up then with Radhakrishnan and Natarajan. Lieutenant Pillai was a Bombay sapper. He was an engineer. And Radhakrishnan was a civilian who was in Singapore, who had joined the Singapore Volunteer Corps, one of the many volunteer units that helped the Allied Army defend Singapore. And Natarajan was a doctor in the Indian Army. So the three of them got together and decided to escape. They managed to get information about how to start the escape, and they managed to scrounge some money. And on the 7th of May, dressed as civilians, they reached the Singapore railway station, got onto a train, and reached northern Malaya within 2 days. And from there, they went to the first contact they had been given, another Tamilian in the city of Penang. And this is how they worked. They went from one contact to the other. When they left Singapore, they only had the name of that fellow Tamilian in Penang. They didn't know anyone else. And they went to that person. He explained to them how to get a passport to go into Thailand. And he gave them another contact of the first town within Thailand to approach for help. And so this is how they moved from one contact to the other. They generally stuck with the South Indian community, who they knew well. They spoke the same language. Many of them were Hindus, though there were many South Indian Muslims who helped them on the way as well. And they went from place to place, and they covered the entire 3,000-mile journey from Singapore to the borders of Burma and Assam, where they met the first units of the Indian Army who were still there. And they did this in an amazing amount of time, which was less than 3 months. So in May, June, and July, they went on this journey. It was less than 100 days. On the 2nd of August, they reached the first unit of the Indian Army that had, the first border unit of the Indian Army in the border area of Burma and Assam, which was the part of India that was bordering Burma. And on the way, they had all three of them wrote accounts of this. There was a post-war, there was an interrogation report submitted by them when they reached, which was mainly written by Radhakrishnan. And after the war, after the war, Lieutenant Pillai wrote a large manuscript, which was published several decades later by his family. And that was his account of what happened. And Lieutenant Natarajan also wrote another he was also interrogated, and in his report was his account of the journey. And the three accounts are all written at different times and are all remarkably alike in terms of, what happened. The differences are very interesting in terms of what each of them focuses on. Pillai's account, because it's a long manuscript that was later published in the book, was, of course, the longest. And a lot of the atmosphere in my book comes from his account. And there was also a conflict between Radhakrishnan and Natarajan. This happens often when you have a group of prisoners escaping, that two of them don't get along. And in this case, Radhakrishnan and Natarajan didn't get along. And each of them has a different view of why this happened. And eventually, when they reached Burma, Lieutenant Dr. Natarajan stayed behind because he felt that proceeding was too dangerous. And he had also found his métier in being a successful doctor in the city of Prom in Burma. So when the Japanese had invaded Burma, most of the many of the Indians had left. Most of the Indians had left, and most of the doctors in the small towns were Indians, so there were no doctors there, and there was a need for doctors, and he filled the gap, and he was very comfortable providing medical help, and he also felt it was too dangerous to move on, so he stayed on, and the two others reached India finally. And they reached, as I said, the border area on 2nd August, and they went from company post to battalion to division to headquarters, and they finally reached Delhi on the 25th of August, 1942, where they were debriefed by military intelligence. At this time, SISDIC had not got into the picture. On 25th August 1942, when they reached Delhi, Britain had no news of what was going on in occupied Southeast Asia. So Pillai and Radhakrishnan were the first officers to give them a detailed update on what was actually going on, what happened in the campaign, how were the prisoners being dealt with, what was happening politically amongst each of the races, what was the situation in every country in Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Burma, etc. And this report was, forwarded to by General Wavell, who was the commander-in-chief of the Indian Army at that time, of course, to India, to London, etc. And after 5 days after 5 days of debriefing, Wavell met them once, and he told Pillai that you have a very interesting book to write, but do this after the war is over. And Pillai listened to him and, of course, wrote the manuscript, though it was published several decades later. On the 31st of August, Wavell recommended a military cross to both Pillai and Radhakrishnan, which was sent to the India office in London, which forwarded it to Buckingham Palace, and the King signed it on 13th of September, and it was published. It was gazetted shortly after in the London Gazette. So this
what
was
a
the story.
Fantastic story. I mean,
Yeah,
that is a truly fantastic story. Thank you.
Yeah. There were other escapes, but this is, the others were quite similar. There was a second group of 2 Sikh and 1 Dogra officers which followed the similar path, but I won't go through that because it's quite similar. Paul, can we move on to the next one? Yep. Okay. So now we move on to the second saga in the book, which is what I call the Papua New Guinea saga. This is the story that actually led me to this book, when someone told me that the Japanese sent thousands of Indian soldiers to labor in islands of the Pacific. And as I discovered, 17,000 Indian POWs were sent to what is now Papua New Guinea, of whom only 7,000 returned home. 10,000 died in the 2.5 years that they spent there and on the way there. And I discovered that they experienced their own version of the Sandakan Death March, their own version of the equivalent of the bridge on the River Kwai, and their own experience in the hell ships. And it is to these hell ships that we'll go to next. The hell ship saga is a very important part of the iconography of World War II, and we hear the unfortunate experience of many thousands of POWs who experienced horror in these hell ships. But I didn't know that Indians actually also experienced similar hell ship experience. And one of the most dramatic ones is this image that you see before you. It's a ship called the Buyo Maru. This was part of the shipping of the 17,000 Indian POWs to PNG. So on the 6th of January 1943, the Buyo Maru left in a convoy from Singapore, in which there were 497 Indian soldiers and over 600 Japanese soldiers and crew on board. And this photograph was taken 3 weeks later, when they were intercepted by the USS Wahoo, the submarine USS Wahoo. It's taken from the periscope of the USS Wahoo. It was a picture taken by the XO, the executive officer, Lieutenant Kane, who wrote a book about his experience in the Wahoo later, where he describes in great detail the sinking of the ship. And the archives also give us descriptions of what was happening. So Lieutenant O'Kane is describing how they found the ship, what he saw when the torpedoes struck the ship. And we also have, I was going to say we fortunately have, but maybe that's the wrong word, but we have an account by Captain OAV Sen, who was the commander of the 497 Indian men on board, who describes what happened to them when the torpedoes struck. So basically, the first set of torpedoes damaged the ship, but the ship remained afloat. Then the second set of torpedoes hit, and according to Lieutenant O'Kane, blew a hole in the hull as big as a Mack truck, as he describes it. And then we take over. Then OAV send reports said that the ship started sinking rapidly. The Japanese ordered all of them to abandon ship, and fortunately, most of them had life rafts, so they got into the water. And uh, uh, we don't know exactly how many men died in the sinking of the ship, but overall, before they were rescued the next day, 195 men died. Indian POWs died. But there was a lot more. There's one other uh, twist to this story, is that after uh, sinking the Buyo Maru and another ship in the convoy and damaging two more, uh, the USS Wahoo's batteries ran out, and the commander, Lieutenant Commander Morton, had to surface. And when he surfaced, he saw before him hundreds of men in the water. There were men, Japanese men in boats with Japanese flags flying, and there were also hundreds of other men in the water, which he may or may not have been able to recognize, identify. And he decided to fire on them. And this was this was not this is not allowed by the conventions of war at that time. And there was an investigation, but the U.S. Navy backed him up, and it's very eloquently written about in the book by the XO. The XO says that his eyes widened when he heard the commanding officer ask his men to action stations when they surfaced. And the lieutenant commander tells him that, look, when our bombers bomb Germany, civilians die, and it can't be helped. So I know these men are sort of helpless here, but we need to make sure that they do not get back to active service, and kill American soldiers. So he decided to fire on them, and we don't know how many Japanese or Indian men died in this exchange, but perhaps some of them did. Um, Sen says that he saw the submarine surface, and many of them waved at them, shouting that we are Indian POWs, but of course they couldn't be heard. And this episode is this occurred, and as I said, the U.S. Navy backed him up. And after this, there were many memorials made to held ships, and the Buyo Maru is not amongst them. So I'm trying to get this added to the memorial at the National Memorial Arboretum. If they cannot, there's a plaque where 20 held ships are honored.
Right.
And I'm trying to see if we can get them. I've given the evidence to them, and we're discussing this. Anyway, that's a different matter.
Great project. Thank you.
Yeah. So now these guys eventually reach Papua New Guinea, and now we go to the words of another Indian. His name is Warrant Officer John Baptist Crasta. So he has written one of two books by Indian POWs who describe their time in Papua New Guinea. And he first refers to their journey in the held ship as "Can Inferno Be Worse?" And then he goes into describing their time in Papua New Guinea. He calls it Torture Island. And he describes, of course, the very familiar harsh conditions in labor camps. He talks about the first bombing raid by American bombers in Papua New Guinea that he experienced personally on 12th October 1943, and how the men were running to save their lives. And interestingly, he describes how some of the Indian soldiers were referring to the American planes as the enemy, because I don't know. I'm telling you frankly, this is how he says it. Because that is what he says in the book, and I don't know whether the word enemy is used. I mean, I guess maybe they just felt that anyone bombing them was their enemy. But anyway, the word was used. They just wanted to be alive, I guess.
Yeah.
But it was used, so I'm saying it. What happened in Papua New Guinea under him, the condition of the soldiers, the lack of medicine, the lack of food, all very well known in other accounts of POW life. So I won't go into that. Moving on to the next slide, which is what happened in the island of New Guinea, which is one of the islands of New Guinea. I also didn't know that New Guinea is the third largest island in the world. It's a huge island,
Mm.
larger than the entire mass of Japan. And in 1944, there were about 3,000 Indian POWs there. And the Allies started landing in in certain parts of the island. There didn't seem to be any. I haven't discovered a concerted uh, invasion approach because they were landing in different parts of the island. And in one of the parts of the island was a Indian camp. Sorry, a camp of with Indian POWs who were doing labor there. Several hundred of them. The senior most officer was his officer of Captain Nirpal Chand. The Japanese ordered him and his men to move to another camp several hundred miles away. This was the equivalent of the Sandakan death march, as I mentioned earlier. And about 3 weeks later, Nirpal Chand told the Japanese that he refuses to order his men to walk any longer because they were already skeletons when they left, and they were, you know, even in a worse condition. And according to post-war uh, reports, there was, as you can see, you can probably guess from what happened here. Captain Nirpal Chand was beheaded by the Japanese on 27th April 1944, and there was considerable evidence about this beheading, and there was a trial held after the war, which I'll explain later. And in the trial, they have the details of what occurred, and from the trial records, we have recreated the scene. Obviously, there was no photograph taken of this event, but this is a sketch made by Giorgio, who has made the 20 other sketches in the book that I hope bring the story to life. You can see that there are four Japanese soldiers, and they're getting ready to behead him. And it took two strokes of the sword to behead him because actually, as we can probably guess, it's not an easy thing to do.
Yeah.
So he was beheaded on 27th April 1944. Now, if we move on, Paul, to the next slide, in 1944 and 1945, the Allies had imposed a severe blockade on Papua New Guinea. They wanted to cut off the southern area and then focus north as they moved island by island to invade Japan eventually. And in this blockade, this basically cut off all supplies to Papua New Guinea, and the dire situation of food and medicines became even worse. And Warrant Officer Crasta, who we encountered earlier, says in his book in the beginning of 1945, he says, if the war did not end by 1945, there was definitely no hope of our survival. So this was how dire the situation was. Uh, as we know, the Japanese surrendered in August 19, in 15th August 1945. And in the next slide, you can see the condition of one of the Indian soldiers. Many of them were like this, and we've seen, these pictures, which are, you can see them as skeletons. This gentleman was from one of the small islands in Papua New Guinea, and he was liberated on 12th September 1945. So though the Japanese emperor had surrendered on 15th August, it took several weeks for the Allies to reach all the
Mm.
various places and camps where the POWs were, and in this gentleman's case, he was liberated on 12th September. When they were liberated, many of them were liberated by the Australians, to whom India owes a huge debt. What the Australians did, besides, of course, Paul, can we move to the next slide? Sorry, I have to go mention one story before we go to the war crimes trials. In New Guinea, the island of New Guinea, as I mentioned, there were 3,000 Indian POWs there. In 1944, due to the uh, landings of Allied soldiers of US soldiers in some parts of New Guinea, 185 soldiers escaped to the Americans. And so there were 2,815 soldiers remaining. When the Allies reached Papua New Guinea, uh, when they reached in September 1945, they found no Indians anywhere. They asked the Japanese how many Indians were here. They told them there were 3,000. Then they asked the Japanese, where are they? The Japanese says, we don't know. It's a very large island, so they'll be all over. On the 27th of September, they found 13 Indian soldiers, and they brought them to their camp. Unfortunately, between finding those 13 and getting them to the camp, two of them were very sick and they died the next day. So actually, only 11 reached the Australian camp. And after after sort of, bringing them back to life by taking care of them with great love. They started talking to them about the war crimes, about what happened to them, what happened to you, and for about a month, these 11 soldiers gave evidence, which was written down in great detail by one of the 11, who was, who was very well educated. And after a month, the Australians told this 11th man that, look, these 10 young men have had a bad time of it, and we think we've got all the evidence we need from them. Why don't we let them go home? Would you be willing to stay on to put all this together in a more formalized way, and then we can, get our get a walk, start the process of the war crimes trials? And he agrees. So these 10 soldiers get onto a plane with 18 other allied men and women, and as you can see in this newspaper article, that plane crashed and all 10 of these men died. And in fact, my book is dedicated to these 10 men. And when they left, they were feeling very happy that they were going home. But at least, I mean, though they died, at least that feeling of I've been liberated and I'm going home was there. And
Yeah.
yeah, it was really, 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 really sad. So there was just one survivor out of the 3,000. And this is the one survivor, which we'll now go to the next slide, which is on the war crimes trials. So the Australians really did a lot in trying to get justice for the Indians. It was a very very well documented, detailed process. They first started by talking to the Indian soldiers, and of course, all the allegations had to be very detailed and documented. So there were hundreds of allegations made. But first, what they did was they held a court of inquiry, which was run by the soldiers themselves, to try to make sure that the allegations was, number one, specific, that there were names, who were the people who were ill-treated, who were the Japanese who did the ill-treating, were they named, and were they alive, firstly. After running through this process, they would the Australians would then uh, present the evidence to the Japanese accused and show them that these are the statements made against you, and what do you have to say about this? After this process, then they would decide, okay, we would hold these following Japanese soldiers to account in specific war crimes trials. So there were 294 war crimes trials held by Australia after the war, of which 100 were specifically against atrocities against Indian soldiers. And the one soldier who remained and did not get on that plane, who fortunately survived, was Subedar Chint Singh of the 2x12, 2nd by 12th Frontier Rifles. And he provided a lot of the evidence and was brought back in 1947 to provide evidence in person against some of the bigger trials, like the command trials against the Japanese generals. So the Australians said that we must not hold just the privates and the sergeants and the captains responsible, but also the generals who oversaw them.
Yeah.
That's what the command trials were about. And the star witness in some of the main command trials was Subedar Chint Singh. And this is a debt to Australia that India owes, that I didn't know about, and I hope people feel the same way about this as I do.
Yeah.
It was a really great thing they did.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Brilliant stuff.
Okay, so moving on to the last two parts of the book, we go back to the INA for a bit. In the INA mythology, it's been recorded, in the memory of the INA. This is something that I must credit to Kevin Knowles, who also pointed me to the archives in India. Kevin has done a detailed research about British memory after the war of the Indian POWs in the INA. And it seems that the British memory was to try to wipe the INA out of existence, from not literally, but figuratively speaking, from the history books, by not mentioning them, or if mentioning them, talking about them only when they surrendered. And we can see that from the various books, including the brilliant From Defeat into Victory, or the treatment of the INA. The INA, the treatment of the INA went to the other extreme by others who attributed the INA, to be the sole people who were fighting against Slim's 14th Army, which was obviously not the case. What actually happened to the INA was that when I'd mentioned earlier, Mohan Singh broke with the Japanese, he was arrested. And then Subhash Chandra Bose was called by the Japanese to come to Singapore. He arrived there in July 1943, and he took the movement to another level. But when it came to the INA, he was very shocked to hear about what the Japanese thought of them. The Japanese said that not only had you surrendered, but you'd also joined the enemy. So we just can't understand you. We cannot use you to fight. So they reluctantly agreed to use a regiment of 3,000 men. But the most important part of the INA that they wanted was a group of about 2,000 men who were called Bahadur units. Bahadur means brave. That was the name that the INA gave to these units. These units were screening the Japanese advance into Imphal. They were doing the reconnaissance. They were getting to meet the Indian civilians, and they, of course, knew some of them knew the area, and of course, they knew the language. So this is what the INA was what the Japanese wanted to use the INA for the screening purpose, which they did. And these 1,500 men did a very good job because in the initial weeks there was an advance of the Japanese towards Imphal, and as we know, they even reached in the borders of Imphal and even Kohima, but they were eventually Slim's 14th Army fought back.
Yeah.
Moving on to the next slide, what the fighting units of the INA did was actually very little, because they were not used. Even though the Japanese said we would use these 3,000 men, they didn't live up to that promise. They first said we would split them up into units of 50 men, and Bose said, no, you mustn't do that. At least use them in battalion strength. And he wanted the first drop of blood in India to be Indian blood when the Japanese reached. So they used one battalion in the southern area of Arakan, which was not the main area, and they used the two other battalions mainly as laborers in the Imphal segment. And you can see this quotation from Shah Nawaz Khan, who commanded that regiment, where he said the Japanese are using the crack INA regiment, referring to his own, as laborers. And of course, the whole Imphal campaign was a debacle for the Japanese. They were soundly defeated, and there was a harrowing retreat, as described by Sugata, by Mr. Bose. The military debacle in Imphal was followed by a harrowing retreat. The rest of 1944 was spent in recovering. I'm sorry, I've misspelled Mr. Bose's name. I need to correct that in the eventual slide. The rest of 1944 was spent in recovering, and then the last attack of Slim's 14th Army began in January 1945, when they crossed the Irrawaddy. And there was a unit of the INA there. There were about 800 men, but they were very ill-equipped and had hardly any weapons. And of course, they tried to do what they could, but within a few hours, the sector they were defended was overcome. And they did try to fight a little more. There was a mountain called Mount Popa, not far from the Irrawaddy, where what is called the last stand of the INA was. And they eventually disintegrated in April 1945. And in May 1945, when the 14th Army reached Rangoon, all of them remaining in Rangoon surrendered. And those remaining with, still, in the jungles of Burma, eventually surrendered later on in that month. So that was what the INA did in Burma. And Paul, if you can move on to the next slide. After the end of the war ended on 15th August, and after the war ended, General Auchinleck, who was now the commander of the Indian Army, faced this dilemma. What was he to do with the INA after the war? There were eventually 22,000 Indian Army men who had volunteered for the INA. There were another 18,000 who were civilians from Malaya. The total was about 40,000, though about only half of them reached Burma, and most of them had no weapons. So they, as I mentioned, couldn't do much fighting. But nonetheless, they had joined the INA, and they had broken their oath to the king, and they had technically committed treason. And what was to be done with these men? Now, Auchinleck was a very fair man. He said, and he told all his officers, that Indians cannot be cannot be judged the same way as Britons regarding loyalty to the king. Every Indian is loyal to India, and every Indian is a nationalist. So we cannot try all the 22,000 or however many survived, because several thousand died in Burma. We cannot try them all for treason.
Yeah.
What he decided to do was, at the same time, he needed uh, to uh, make sure that loyalty was an important factor. So he was on the horns of a dilemma. He needed the Indian army to remain loyal. At that time in 1945, it was not expected that India would become independent in 2 years. It was expected that it would take, I don't know, 5, maybe more years before that would happen. And in that time, the Cold War was starting, and Britain expected and wanted to use the Indian army for the Cold War and other conflicts that were to break out in Southeast Asia. So he needed a loyal army, and he needed to reward loyalty. To reward loyalty, he needed to make sure that disloyalty was punished. So what he did was he decided to try initially a group of 600 INA men who had committed atrocities against other Indian army soldiers. And the first trial started in November 1945. And if you can go to the next slide, this trial was, I think, a public relations disaster for the British. Uh, Instead of starting with a trial on atrocities, they decided to start a trial on focusing on treason, which was not treason against Britain in 1945 would not be considered much of a crime by most Indians at that time, and because the nationalist feeling was very high.
Mm.
Not only that, they chose three very well-spoken Indian men, one a Hindu, one a Muslim, and the third a Sikh. So they had, by holding, combining these three men, they had basically thrown down the cudgel against the three largest communities of India and sort of united India in a way. And as expected, when news of the INA broke in the newspapers, um, there was great Indian sympathy for the INA, and that was the achievement of the INA, in my view. They didn't really win the, didn't really get a fighting chance to fight
Yeah.
in Burma, but their great victory was enthusing the people of India after the war. And very soon after this, in early 1946, and again, you can see this from, I tried to understand what had actually happened. What did the Indian soldier think of the INA? Not the INA soldier, but the 2.5 million Indians who had volunteered for the Indian army, who were not in the INA. And again, the archives tell us what the Indian soldier thought, and most of them without exception, were in support of it. They said, "We won the war. Let's be generous. Let these guys be. They didn't have a choice, and we shouldn't go after them." So the British decided, this was the impact of the INA, that they decided that they had basically lost the loyalty of the Indian army, and without that, they could not hold India. And they, uh, you know, uh, decided to leave India earlier than they had planned. And of course, my book doesn't go into the partition, but India became independent about a year and a half after this decision in August 1945. So this is the sort of the story of the Indian troops, and I think there's just one other story that I'd like to mention, which is in post-war memory.
Yeah.
Um there's a very poignant story of the waiting wives. These soldiers had been in they'd been sent to Malaya in 1940-41, and they had their wives had no news of them. There were no letters. The Japanese were not giving information. They didn't even give much information about British and Australian POWs, but they gave even less information about Indian POWs, because they were trying to say that we are in charge of the Asians and don't ask us. We are taking care of them. Don't worry about them. So there was very little news, and these young women, many of them were, of course, very young. They had young children. They had little money, and they had to survive for 5 years to take care of their kids. And there were two poignant stories that I have. One of course, of fortunately a husband who returns, and the other, unfortunately, of a husband who doesn't. And I did not realize, um, you know, to be honest, I was thinking of the soldiers and not of their wives. But
Mm.
when I reached out to various family members, I discovered this very poignant story, and I feel that I had put four men on the cover, and I should have put a fifth person, which was the waiting wife.
Yeah.
And it's really sad to see their plight and how they how they somehow managed to survive. So that is the story of the book. And I just one last slide, which is basically about you know the there was another poignant quote from one of the officers who wrote a book. He said that I never dream, I never sleep without having a nightmare of getting bombed. So he was a soldier in the Indian Army. And this soldier adds another interesting thing. He says that during the Malayan campaign, air superiority was the Japanese. So we were getting bombed by the Japanese. In Burma, air superiority was with the Allies. So we were once again getting bombed. So this poor officer was in whichever battle he fought, he was on the losing side and on the side that didn't have air superiority. And he mentioned this in terms of how the family treated war memory. It varies. One of them said to me that when he read his father's memoir, he thought it was very badly written and he wanted to throw it away. And fortunately, he didn't, and that was one of the books published. It's Crasta's book. In the case of Pillai, who escaped, he had been encouraged to write a book, and his family also encouraged him. But he said that, look, this was decades after the war. He said, I wrote a report that I gave to intelligence, and I want to see that report before I publish the book because I want to verify my facts, because this happened 50 years ago. Unfortunately, the report was classified while he was alive, and he died before it was declassified. But fortunately, his family did get the report, and they published the book. And so there are all these various stories about how the family, dealt with post-war memory and history. And one of the most endearing stories I heard was about Mohan Singh when he went back to India. Uh, he was exiled by the Japanese, and in the last 2 years of his exile, he had only two companions, Ratan Singh and Chitra Bahadur. And they made a pact that if India would become free, they would live together as brothers. And actually, they redeemed that pledge, because after the war, Mohan Singh called these other two men. He fortunately was more, he had a house. They didn't. He called them over, and he had 3 bedrooms in his house. He had one bedroom for himself and gave the other 2 bedrooms to each of these two men. And he treated them like brothers. And in an incredible act, during his lifetime, he shared his property equally between these two men. And the broader family, lived as a one family, and they continue to do that till the third generation today. So this is, these are some of the various incredible family stories that I found very moving and poignant, and that's how I end the book. So
One more. We've got that photo there of a 100th birthday party, and then we'll do a few questions.
Yes. So Lance Naik Charan Singh is the only veteran who I actually managed to meet. He did not actually fight in the war, but he arrived amongst the Indian soldiers who liberated Singapore. And he was in the service corps, and his job was to feed the soldiers. And I met him very fortuitously in a village in Punjab 2 years ago. And I was very happy to be able to be one of the people who helped arrange his 100th birthday celebration last year. You can see him sitting on the sofa in the middle, the Sikh gentleman in the slight Sikh gentleman in the white shirt, with the brigadier sitting next to him. And there was a letter sent by the colonel in chief of the service corps, which he cherishes. And it was, I think, one of the best things I was able to do.
Well, thank you very much. We have a few questions for you, which I didn't want to interrupt your flow because it was being so good. So the questions are, well, first is a comment Fred is, greetings from Bangkok. I've toured battlefields India, Malaysia, Singapore. This is the best presentation I've seen on the INI. So that's very good.
Thank you, Frank.
Gary is asking about museums or contacts or associations. You mentioned to me before going live that you're part of the various POW groups, but is there any particular other resources people can visit with regards to prisoners or the INI that you are aware of?
Yes, there are two very good resources that are available online. One is the AWM, the Australian War Memorial, which has dozens of online documents. If you go to their site and search on Indian POW, you will get lots of documents. And once you get one document, you'll be able to, search on various others.
Okay.
The other website is the other archive, which has online information, is the National Archives of India, which has a great amount of information, though searching on it is not that easy. I have put I will after this, put out on my social media a guide on how to search on the National
Okay.
Archives of India,
Brilliant.
which will hopefully help some people to navigate through it. But these are the two main things. There are many others, but these are the two big ones, all available online. You can look at it right now.
Okay, thank you. Next one is we just did that one. I thought during the time of when they were, for example, in Papua New Guinea, in the time there of the bad treatment, incarcerations, what the Indian public knew about that. Fraser said, how was the Indian POW conditions reported back in India? Did the public know about the conditions? So, for example, if you're an Australian housewife, there was some information getting through to Sydney and Melbourne about what was happening in Changi. Not much, but there was some. If you're an Indian, the relatives of Indian, did you know nothing about where your loved one was?
So there was some information, but very little of it. But that was mainly for those who were in Singapore.
Right.
So I have heard of a postcard reaching or a letter reaching, but very, very few. And the Japanese did give some lists to the British based on which the family was informed, but the information was very scanty. As far as Papua New Guinea was concerned, even the Allies didn't know till March 1944, when they rescued the first set of Indian soldiers, that any of them had been sent there. And it was only later on that they discovered this. And yes, the Indian public had no idea about really what was going on with their family. I don't see any reports in the Indian press about conditions of POWs immediately after, during the war, or very few reports during the war or even after the war when the soldiers came back. So, there was very little information that they had.
Okay, thank you. And Scott over in the States is saying, are you aware of the fact there are remains of Indian POWs who died in Japanese captivity are in Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery outside of St. Louis, Missouri? Did you know there are Indian prisoners?
No, I didn't at all. That's fantastic news. I'm going to
write
that down.
I will put the two of you in touch, because Scott's a long time watcher and been a presenter himself. So I will get the two of you in touch. There's a backstory there, I feel, that's worth exploring.
I'm sure. How they got there, I wonder.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so no, but we'll put you in touch. And then the last, which I think is a very good question from Chaz, and it's about, did the INA provide religious and spiritual leaders like the Germans did, e.g. imams for Muslim SS troops? Because, as you said, there are people coming from different regions, different backgrounds. I'm assuming they were allowed to do some sort of religious, but I mean, even with the issue of rations, I mean, Slim had that problem with Indians in the British Army to make sure there's appropriate foods. But what was allowed within the INA under the Japanese?
Well, okay, since you mentioned food, let me talk about that. There were 22 different canteens in the Indian Army because of different, as you mentioned, different types of conditions, how they wanted the food made. Not just Hindu, Muslim, but it was mainly Muslim was 1 and 21 were Hindu canteens, because they had different ways. And one of the things that Mohan Singh began was to try to break this communal divide. And he says everyone will, one of the ways they tried to do this was they said, okay, there are these two ways of preparing meat, similar to the kosher way. One is halal, which is the Muslim way, and jhatka, which is the Hindu and Sikh way. One of the officers said, we'll kill two goats halal, 2 goats jhatka, mix it up, and everyone will eat. And unfortunately, that didn't work. And eventually, they had to stick to jhalal and jhatka and halal in most cases. As regarding imams, I think the INA did not officially do this, but the soldiers, did it themselves. So there were no officially appointed priests like the British did, like perhaps the Germans did for the Free India Legion that they had set up in Europe. Okay. So the answer to that question is no.
Okay.
The INA didn't appoint priests, to my knowledge.
Well, I think we will end things there. Again, thank you very much for a fantastic presentation. The links to the book are in the description below, and I put the link to the Penguin in India. If you are watching at that in that part of the world, you can already buy the book. If you're in Britain or elsewhere, you have to wait a few more weeks. But I urge you to get it because it's filling in a part of our understanding of this bit of the war that we didn't know. So there we go. So thanks everybody for your fantastic questions. I'm back in whatever it is, 8 hours time, with a show with Paul Johnson. But in the meantime, as always, consider becoming a channel member or a patron. Buy my guest books, read their blogs, follow them on social media, and I will see you all next time. Thank you very much, everybody, for watching. This has been brilliant. Cheers. Goodbye, everybody.
Ciao. Bye.